Welcome to Enigma of the Unknown, where we uncover the most chilling and mysterious tales from around the world. Tonight, we journey into the haunted forests and lakes of New York, a state known for its natural beauty and its dark, lingering legends, from the cursed whispers of Lake George to the shadowy figure in Sterling Forest. These 10 camping stories will make you think twice about spending a night in the Empire State's wilderness. Turn down the lights, settle in, and prepare for a spine-tingling exploration of New York's eerie secrets. Story number 1. The Watcher in High Peaks. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. Ghost stories and urban legends were for campfires and late-night movies, not something I ever thought could touch my life. But after what happened to us in the High Peaks wilderness, I'm not so sure anymore. It started as a simple weekend getaway with my friends, Mike, Rachel, and Sarah. We were all in desperate need of a break from the grind of daily life, and Mike suggested the Adirondacks. High Peaks is beautiful this time of year, he said. Plus, we can finally tackle some of those trails we've been talking about. The idea of being disconnected from the world for a few days appealed to all of us. No emails, no social media, just fresh air, hiking, and good company. So, we packed our gear, loaded the car, and headed north. The drive up was filled with laughter and excitement. The forest grew denser as we approached, the air cooler and crisper. By the time we arrived at the trailhead, the sun was beginning to dip below the treetops, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. We hiked for about an hour before finding a clearing to set up camp. The spot was perfect, secluded, quiet, with a small stream nearby for water. We pitched our tents, gathered firewood, and settled in for the night. As the fire crackled, we shared stories and joked about Mike's insistence on bringing a can of bear spray. "You never know," he said, grinning. "Better safe than sorry." By the time we crawled into our sleeping bags, the forest was pitch black, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, at least. First, I woke sometime in the middle of the night, the kind of half-sleep where you're aware of your surroundings but not fully awake. First, I thought the sound that woke me was just the wind, but as I listened, I realized it was something else, soft, deliberate footsteps crunching on the forest floor. I held my breath, heart pounding. The steps were slow, measured, moving around the perimeter of our camp. I glanced at my phone. 3:12 a.m. "Mike," I whispered, barely audible. "You awake?" No response. I strained to hear, my pulse hammering in my ears. The footsteps stopped, replaced by silence so profound it was almost deafening. I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and tried to go back to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. The next morning, I told the others about the footsteps. Mike laughed it off. "Probably just a critter," he said, brushing crumbs off his lap. "This is their home, after all." "Yeah, but it sounded bigger than that," I said. "Relax," Rachel chimed in. "We're in the middle of the wilderness. It's bound to sound creepy at night." Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. We spent the day hiking one of the nearby trails, the beauty of the area momentarily distracting me from my lingering unease. The forest was breathtaking, towering pines, sunlight filtering through the canopy, the scent of earth and leaves. But even in the daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was subtle, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a whisper of movement just beyond my peripheral vision. Every now and then, I'd stop and glance behind us, expecting to see someone or something following. "Jake, you okay?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowed. "Yeah," I lied. "Just thought I saw something." She looked over her shoulder, her expression uneasy. "Let's keep moving." That night, the unease turned to outright fear. We were sitting around the campfire again, the flames casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. The conversation had turned to ghost stories, each of us taking turns trying to outdo the other. Mike was in the middle of recounting a particularly gruesome tale when Rachel froze, her eyes fixed on something behind me. "Did you see that?" she whispered. "See what?" I asked, turning around. She pointed toward the edge of the clearing. "I swear, I just saw someone standing there." Mike shone his flashlight in the direction she pointed, but the beam illuminated only trees and underbrush. "Probably your imagination," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Rachel shook her head. "I'm not imagining things." We sat in uneasy silence, the forest suddenly feeling much darker and more oppressive. Later that night, the footsteps returned. This time, there was no mistaking it, slow, deliberate steps circling the camp, crunching on leaves and twigs. Sarah sat up in her tent, whispering my name. "Jake, do you hear that?" "Yeah," I whispered back. "Stay inside." Mike unzipped his tent and stepped out, clutching the can of bear spray. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice firm. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the silence was suffocating. Then, a faint laugh, low, guttural, and completely devoid of humor, echoed through the trees. "Get back in the tent," I hissed. Mike didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled back inside, zipping it up as quickly as he could. We stayed awake for hours, listening to the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional crack of a branch. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement, shadows shifting just beyond the firelight, but when I focused, there was nothing there. By morning, we were all on edge. "We need to leave," I said, breaking the tense silence. "Agreed," Rachel said. "Whatever's out there, I don't want to find out." We packed up quickly, stuffing our gear into our packs and extinguishing the fire. The hike back to the car felt longer than it should have. The forest oppressive and silent. None of us spoke. Every sound, every rustle, every snap of a twig, making us jump. As we neared the trailhead, Mike froze. "Did you hear that?" he asked. We all stopped, straining to listen. Faintly, from somewhere behind us, came the sound of footsteps, light but unmistakable. They stopped when we did, resuming only when we moved. "Let's go," Sarah said, her voice shaking. We broke into a jog, the footsteps quickening to match our pace. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a figure standing far down the trail. A man, tall and shadowy, watching us. When I shone my flashlight on him, he vanished. We reached the car and piled in, slamming the doors and locking them. Mike started the engine, and we sped down the dirt road, the forest blurring past. No one spoke until we were miles away, the tension finally breaking as the trees gave way to open fields. "What the hell was that?" Rachel finally said, her voice trembling. None of us had an answer. In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize what we'd experienced. Maybe it was a prankster, someone messing with campers. But the way the figure moved, the way it vanished, it felt wrong, like it wasn't bound by the same rules of reality. I started researching the High Peaks wilderness and found countless stories similar to ours. Campers reporting being watched, hearing footsteps, seeing figures that disappeared when approached. Some claimed it was the spirit of a lost hiker, others a malevolent entity tied to the land. Whatever it was, I haven't been back to the Adirondacks since, and I don't plan to. If you ever find yourself in the High Peaks wilderness and feel like you're being watched, trust your instincts, pack up, leave, and don't look back, because sometimes the forest watches back, and it doesn't always look away. Story number 2. The Monster of Tupper Lake. I was never much of a camper. My idea of roughing it was a weekend without Wi-Fi. But my girlfriend, Sarah, had a different outlook. She loved the outdoors, the solitude, the fresh air, the unfiltered beauty of nature. When she suggested a trip to Tupper Lake in the Adirondacks, I reluctantly agreed. "A couple of nights," she promised. "Just us and the wilderness." It sounded romantic, but I'd heard stories about the Adirondacks. legends of strange occurrences and mysterious creatures lurking in its dense forests and sprawling lakes. Of course, I dismissed them as exaggerated campfire tales. I figured the scariest thing we'd encounter would be a raccoon rummaging through our cooler. We arrived on a bright Friday morning, the sunlight filtering through the trees as we drove down a dirt road leading to a secluded campsite by the lake. The water was calm, a perfect mirror reflecting the surrounding pines. It was almost too quiet, the kind of silence that made you hyper-aware of every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. "This is perfect," Sarah said, beaming as she climbed out of the car. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and for a moment, I let my skepticism fade. We spent the day setting up camp, exploring the nearby trails, and paddling across the lake in an old canoe Sarah had rented. The water was so clear we could see the bottom near the shore, but as we paddled toward the deeper sections, it turned an inky black, the depths obscured. I felt a strange unease as we floated over the darkness, but I said nothing. Sarah seemed so happy, and I didn't want to ruin it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the lake took on a different character. The once inviting water now looked cold and impenetrable, the surface shimmering faintly under the rising moon. We lit a fire and cooked dinner, the crackling flames providing a comforting contrast to the growing chill in the air. "Did you know there's a legend about this lake?" Sarah asked as she poured us each a cup of hot cocoa. "Let me guess," I said, rolling my eyes. "Some ghost haunting the woods?" "Not a ghost," she said, leaning closer. "A monster," I chuckled nervously. "Oh, come on. I'm serious," she insisted. "Locals say there's something living in the lake. Something big. People have reported seeing it, hearing strange sounds at night, even feeling like they're being watched. Probably just a big fish," I said, trying to brush it off. "Maybe," she said, her tone playful but with a hint of something else. "But wouldn't it be exciting if it were real?" "Exciting isn't the word I'd use," I muttered, glancing uneasily at the dark water. That night, I woke to a sound. First, I thought it was the wind, but as I listened, I realized it was something else. A low, deep rumble, like a distant growl, vibrating through the ground beneath me. I sat up in the tent, my heart pounding. "Sarah," I whispered, shaking her gently. "Wake up. What?" she mumbled, half asleep. "Do you hear that?" She sat up, frowning. The sound had stopped. "Jake, it's probably just the water," she said. "Go back to sleep." But I couldn't shake the unease. I lay awake, listening to the silence, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be out there. The next morning, I tried to laugh off my fears. Sarah teased me about being jumpy, but I could tell she was trying to make me feel better. We spent the day fishing and hiking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As dusk fell, the sense of unease returned. The lake was eerily still, the air heavy with a damp chill. We sat by the fire, talking and laughing, but the mood felt forced. Then came the splash. It was loud, like something heavy had hit the water. We both froze, staring toward the lake. "What was that?" Sarah whispered. "Probably just a fish," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Another splash, closer this time. Then a ripple spread across the surface, faint but deliberate, as if something massive was moving beneath the water. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the lake. The beam caught only the surface, which had returned to an unsettling calm. "Maybe we should go inside," Sarah said, her voice tight. We retreated to the tent, zipping it up tightly. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Around midnight, I woke again, this time to the sound of movement outside the tent. It was faint at first, like something dragging along the ground, but it grew louder, closer. Then came the breathing, heavy, guttural, almost wet. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my ears. "Jake," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "What is that?" I don't know, I whispered back. The sound moved past the tent, circling us. I reached for the flashlight, my hand shaking, and unzipped the flap just enough to peek out. What I saw made my blood run cold. A massive shadow loomed near the edge of the lake, partially obscured by the mist. It was hunched, its form indistinct but undeniably large. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the moonlight, and its head turned slowly, scanning the shore. Then it looked toward the tent. I ducked back inside, pulling the zipper closed as quietly as I could. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "Something's out there," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. We sat in terrified silence as the sound of footsteps, or was it slithering, moved away from the tent and toward the water. There was a heavy splash, followed by silence. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the first light broke through the trees, we packed up camp. Neither of us spoke about what we'd heard or seen. The unspoken agreement was to get out of there as quickly as possible. As we loaded the car, I glanced back at the lake. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a ripple, a shadow moving just beneath the surface. But when I blinked, it was gone. In the weeks that followed, I tried to convince myself it had been my imagination, that the shadows and sounds were nothing more than tricks of the mind. But Sarah and I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd encountered something real. Out of curiosity, I started researching the area. I found stories dating back centuries, accounts of strange sightings on the lake, of disappearances and unexplained noises. One article mentioned a Native American legend about a creature that lived in the depths of Tupper Lake, a guardian of the water that emerged only to protect its territory. The more I read, the more convinced I became that what we'd experienced wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Sarah and I haven't been camping since. I've stayed away from lakes entirely, and even the sound of running water sets me on edge. Sometimes, late at night, I dream about the creature. I see its glowing eyes, feel its presence looming over me. I wake in a cold sweat, heart racing, the memory of that night as vivid as ever. And though I try to forget, I can't help but wonder, is it still out there, lurking in the depths, waiting for the next unsuspecting campers to stray too close? If you ever find yourself at Tupper Lake and hear something moving beneath the water, do yourself a favor. Don't look. Don't stay. Some things are better left unseen. Story number 3. The Ghost Hunter of Harriman Forest. I've always been drawn to the woods. Growing up in New York City, the concrete jungle offered little in the way of true wilderness. So when my old college buddies, Mike, Dave, and Tom, suggested a weekend camping trip to Harriman State Park, I jumped at the chance. We all needed a break from the grind, and the park's extensive trails and secluded spots promised the escape we craved. We arrived on a crisp Friday afternoon in late October. The trees were ablaze with autumn colors, fiery reds, burnt oranges, and golden yellows. The air was cool but not cold, perfect for hiking and campfires. We found a spot off one of the less traveled trails, near a small clearing surrounded by towering oaks and maples. As we set up our tents, an older man came down the trail. He wore a ranger's uniform, his face weathered but friendly. "Evening, folks," he said. "Not many people out this way." "That's the idea," Mike replied with a grin. The ranger nodded. "Well, just make sure you keep your fires controlled and pack out what you pack in." "Will do," I assured him. He hesitated for a moment. "You fellas heard any stories about this area?" Dave laughed. "You mean the ghost stories? We can handle a few campfire tales." The ranger gave a thin smile. "Just be careful. Strange things happen out here, especially at night." With that, he tipped his hat and continued down the trail. "Well, that wasn't ominous at all," Tom remarked. We finished setting up camp and gathered wood for the fire. As dusk settled in, we cooked dinner and settled around the flames, sharing beers and stories. The conversation inevitably turned to the ranger's warning. "You think he was trying to spook us?" Dave asked. Probably, Mike said. Or maybe he was just messing with the city boys. I heard a story about this place. Tom began, his face lit eerily by the firelight. They say a hunter died out here years ago, a hunting accident. But some say it wasn't an accident at all. Here we go, I sighed, though I felt a slight chill. They say his spirit roams these woods, wearing a cowboy hat and carrying his rifle, looking for those who wronged him. That's just a legend, Mike scoffed. Maybe, Tom replied, but people have reported seeing him, hearing gunshots in the middle of the night with no one else around. Well, let's hope he doesn't mistake us for his enemies, Dave joked. We laughed it off and continued swapping stories until the fire burned low. One by one, we retreated to our tents. I awoke sometime in the middle of the night. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting a faint orange glow. The forest was silent, no rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, just an oppressive quiet. Then I heard it, a gunshot, sharp and clear, echoing through the trees. I sat bolt upright, heart pounding. Did you hear that? I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. Another gunshot rang out, closer this time. I unzipped my tent and stepped into the cold night air. A fog had settled in, wisps of mist curling around the trees. I looked around but saw nothing unusual. Mike? Dave? Tom? I called softly. Their tents remained closed. No signs of movement. Maybe I had dreamed it. As I turned to go back inside, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving between the trees. It was the silhouette of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a wide-brimmed hat. Hello, I called out. No response. Who's there? Silence. I felt a shiver run down my spine, telling myself it was just my imagination. I retreated into my tent and zipped it up tight. Sleep did not come easily. The next morning, over breakfast, I mentioned what I'd heard and seen. Probably just hunters, Mike said, sipping his coffee. Out here at that hour? I questioned. Could be, Dave added. But we should be careful. Don't want to get mistaken for deer. Maybe it was the ghost hunter, Tom said with a grin. I forced a laugh, but unease lingered. We spent the day hiking deeper into the forest, exploring trails that were little more than faint paths through the underbrush. The beauty of the place was undeniable, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As the sun began to set, we headed back to camp. The conversation was light, but there was an undercurrent of tension. That night, we built the fire higher, its warmth and light a comforting barrier against the encroaching darkness. To a great day in the wild, Mike toasted. Here, here. We echoed, clinking our cans together. As the night wore on, the stories turned spooky again. Did you know, Tom began, that some people think the hunter's ghost is actually guarding something? Like buried treasure or a hidden cabin. Or maybe he's just lost, Dave suggested, stuck between worlds. Well, whatever he is, I hope he lets us sleep tonight, I said. Eventually, we turned in. I lay awake, listening to the crackle of the dying fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. Around midnight, the forest fell silent again. Then, the gunshots returned, 3 in rapid succession, each one closer than the last. I held my breath, straining to hear any other sounds. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the fallen leaves. A shadow passed outside my tent, blocking out the faint glow from the embers. Who's there? I whispered, my voice barely audible. No answer. Summoning my courage, I peeked out of the tent. The fog was thicker tonight, swirling around like ghostly tendrils. The shadow stood at the edge of the clearing, a man in a cowboy hat, holding a rifle. Guys, I hissed, wake up. The figure turned its head toward me, though his face was obscured by darkness. I felt his gaze piercing through me. Mike and the others emerged from their tents, rubbing sleep from their eyes. What is it? Mike asked. I pointed toward the figure, but it was gone. I saw him, I insisted. "The hunter." "Very funny," Tom said, yawning. "I'm serious." Before they could respond, another gunshot cracked through the night. This one so close it seemed to come from within the camp. We all jumped. "Okay, that was real," Dave said, eyes wide. "Maybe we should check it out," Mike suggested. "Are you crazy?" I replied. "We should stay here. Stay here and wait for whoever or whatever is shooting at us?" Tom argued. Reluctantly, we grabbed our flashlights and sticks from the fire as makeshift torches. We moved as a group toward where we thought the shots had come from. The fog made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. "Hello," Mike called out. "Is someone there?" Silence. Then, footsteps behind us. We spun around, shining our lights. The beams caught only trees and mist. "This is messed up," Dave muttered. A whisper came from the darkness. A low, raspy voice that sent chills down my spine. "Leave now." "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Yeah," Tom whispered. "Let's get out of here." We retreated back to camp, but the tents were gone. "What the?" Mike exclaimed. The clearing was empty save for the dying embers of our fire. "This isn't possible," I stammered. "We didn't go that far." Panic set in. We were lost in the woods at night, with something or someone stalking us. "Stay calm," Mike said, though his voice shook. "We need to find the trail back." We huddled together, moving cautiously through the forest. The fog seemed to thicken, and the trees loomed like dark sentinels. Gunshots rang out again, each one closer than the last. "Run!" Dave shouted. We sprinted through the woods, branches whipping at our faces. The ground was uneven, and I stumbled, falling hard. "Help me!" I called out. The others stopped and came back for me. "Come on," Tom urged, pulling me to my feet. As we resumed running, the figure appeared ahead of us, blocking our path. He stood motionless, the rifle pointed downward. His face was still hidden, but I felt a malevolent presence. "Why are you doing this?" Mike yelled. "Leave now," the voice repeated. "We're trying," I shouted back. The figure raised the rifle. "Get down," Tom yelled. We dropped to the ground as a deafening shot echoed above us. "That's it," Dave cried. "This way." We veered off the path, crashing through the underbrush. Suddenly, the fog began to lift, and we burst onto a dirt road. "My car should be this way," Mike said breathlessly. We ran down the road, and sure enough, the parking area came into view. We piled into the car, and Mike tore out of there like a bat out of hell. As we sped away, I glanced back. The figure stood at the edge of the woods, watching us leave. We didn't stop driving until we reached the city. In the days that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened. Some of us thought it was a crazed hunter messing with us. Others believed we'd encountered something supernatural. I did some digging into the park's history. Turns out that, years ago, a man named Samuel Granger had died in a hunting accident in that very area. Some said he was shot by a fellow hunter who mistook him for game. Others whispered that it was no accident, that he'd been killed over a dispute. Legend had it that his spirit couldn't rest, forever wandering the woods, warning others to stay away. I don't know what we saw that night, but I do know that I haven't set foot in Harriman State Park since, and I don't plan to. If you ever decide to go camping there and hear gunshots in the night or catch sight of a shadowy figure in a cowboy hat, take my advice, pack up and leave, because some legends are more than just stories, and some spirits don't take kindly to trespassers. Story number 4. The Curse of Lake George. I've always been a city dweller, more accustomed to the cacophony of honking horns and bustling crowds than the serene silence of nature. So when my girlfriend Emily suggested a camping trip to Lake George, I was hesitant. She grew up spending summers there, and the lake held a special place in her heart. "Come on, Jake," she implored, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "You'll love it. The fresh air will do you good." Reluctantly, I agreed. A weekend getaway might be just what I needed to clear my head from the relentless grind of the advertising world. We set off on a crisp Friday morning, the city skyline fading in the rearview mirror as we drove north. The transition from concrete jungle to sprawling forest was almost jarring. Towering skyscrapers gave way to towering pines, and the air grew cleaner with each mile. By late afternoon, we arrived at a quaint campground nestled along the shores of Lake George. The water was a mirror, reflecting the fiery hues of the setting sun. It was undeniably beautiful. "See, isn't this perfect?" Emily beamed. I smiled, taking in the view. "Yeah, it's something else." We pitched our tent near the water's edge, the gentle lapping of waves providing a soothing soundtrack. As darkness fell, we built a small fire and settled in for the evening. "Did you know this lake is over 32 miles long?" Emily mused, poking at the fire with a stick. "That's a lot of water," I replied, sipping a beer. She leaned in closer, and it's got its fair share of ghost stories. I raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah, locals say that on quiet nights, you can hear whispers coming from the lake. Some even claim to see figures moving across the water." I chuckled. "Sounds like tales to scare off the tourists." She shrugged, a playful glint in her eye. "Maybe, or maybe it's true." We let the conversation drift to other topics, and soon, the fatigue of the day caught up with us. We retreated into our tent, the cool night air wrapping around us. I woke to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling through the trees, but as I listened, I realized it was more than that. A soft murmur, like distant voices engaged in hushed conversation. I glanced at my watch. 2:13 a.m. Emily slept soundly beside me, her steady breathing a stark contrast to the unease creeping over me. I sat up, straining to hear. The whispers grew slightly louder, still indistinct but undeniably there. Curiosity getting the better of me. I unzipped the tent flap and stepped outside. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silvery glow over the lake. A thin mist clung to the water's surface, swirling gently. The whispers seemed to emanate from the lake itself. "Hello," I called out softly. No response. I walked closer to the shore, the damp grass cool beneath my bare feet. The air was still, not a breeze to be felt. Yet, the whispers persisted. "Is anyone out there?" Silence. I shook my head, chiding myself for letting a spooky campfire story get under my skin. I turned to head back to the tent when something caught my eye. Out on the lake, maybe 100 yards from shore, were faint silhouettes, humanoid shapes that seemed to glide across the water. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. The figures moved gracefully, almost dancing atop the mist. There were 4 of them. Their forms were translucent, wavering like smoke. A chill ran down my spine. "Emily," I whispered urgently, backing away from the water's edge. "Emily, wake up." I stumbled back into the tent, shaking her shoulder. What's wrong?" she murmured sleepily. "There's something on the lake." She sat up, rubbing her eyes. "What are you talking about?" "Just come look." We stepped outside, but the mist had thickened, obscuring the view. "I don't see anything," she said, squinting into the darkness. "The whispers, do you hear them?" She tilted her head, listening. After a moment, she shook her head. "Jake, I think you were dreaming." I wasn't. There were figures on the water, and I heard voices. She smiled gently. "Your imagination is running wild. Come back to bed." I wanted to argue but decided against it. Maybe she was right. The next morning, the incident felt like a distant memory. The sun shone brightly, and the lake was tranquil. Emily convinced me to go for a swim, and we spent the day exploring the surrounding woods. By evening, I'd all but forgotten about the night's events. We sat by the fire after dinner, the sky awash with stars. "Remember last night?" Emily asked teasingly. "When you thought you saw ghosts?" I chuckled. "Yeah, maybe I was just tired." She leaned in, her expression turning serious. "You know, when I was a kid, My grandmother told me stories about this lake. More ghost tales. Sort of. She said the lake is a gateway between worlds, that sometimes spirits get lost and wander here. I smirked. Well, if I see any tonight, I'll be sure to give them directions. She playfully swatted my arm. I'm serious. All right, I'll keep an open mind. That night, sleep eluded me. Emily drifted off easily, but I lay awake, listening. Around 1 a.m., the whispers returned. This time, they were clearer, multiple voices overlapping, speaking in hushed tones I couldn't understand. I sat up, my heart pounding. A faint glow emanated from the lake, peering through the tent's mesh window. I saw them again, the figures. There were more now, perhaps a dozen, their ethereal forms illuminated by an otherworldly light. They moved in a slow procession across the water, heading toward the shore. Panic surged through me. Emily, I hissed, shaking her awake. She groaned. What is it? Look. She followed my gaze and gasped. You see them? I asked. She nodded slowly. What are they? The figures reached the shore, gliding onto the land without breaking stride. They moved silently among the trees, heading in our direction. We need to leave, I whispered. Emily grabbed my hand, her grip tight. Maybe they're not dangerous. Are you kidding? Let's go. We scrambled out of the tent, fumbling in the dark to gather our essentials. The figures drew closer, their faces still obscured. One of them stopped a few yards away, turning its head toward us. Though featureless, I felt its gaze penetrate me. Why are you here? A voice echoed in my mind, not spoken aloud. I froze. Did you hear that? Emily looked at me, fear etched on her face. Hear what? It asked why we're here. She shook her head. I didn't hear anything. The figure extended an arm, beckoning. Join us. The voice whispered in my mind. I stumbled back. Stay away. Emily grabbed my arm. Jake, we need to go. Now. We abandoned the tent and ran toward the car parked nearby. The figures didn't follow but watched as we fled. We sped away from the campsite, the narrow road winding through the darkness. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. What the hell was that? I muttered. Emily stared straight ahead. I don't know. We drove in silence until we reached the main road. Only then did I feel like we could breathe. Maybe we should report this, I suggested. To who? The police? What would we even say? She had a point. We checked into a motel for the night, neither of us wanting to continue driving while exhausted. Sleep was fitful. My dreams were plagued by images of the figures and the haunting whispers. The next morning, over a bleak continental breakfast, Emily broke the silence. I think we should go back. I nearly choked on my coffee. What? Why? Maybe we can find an explanation. Closure. Emily, those things weren't natural. Exactly. Don't you want to know what we saw? I shook my head adamantly. No, I want to forget it. She reached across the table, her eyes pleading. Please, Jake, for me. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We returned to the campsite in broad daylight. The area was untouched, our tent and belongings just as we left them. See, it's fine, Emily said, though her voice wavered. We packed up our gear, and I felt a strange compulsion to walk to the water's edge one last time. As I stood there, a gentle breeze rippled the surface. The lake looked innocent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it hid something profound. Jake, Emily called from behind. Ready to go? I nodded, turning to leave. Wait, a faint voice whispered. I spun around. Did you hear that? Emily shook her head. Hear what? Someone said, wait. She looked uneasy. Let's just go. I hesitated but followed her to the car. As we pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the shore, watching us leave. Back in the city, life returned to normal, but the experience lingered like a shadow. Nights were the worst. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the whispers echoing in my mind. Emily seemed unaffected. Or at least she pretended to be. She threw herself back into work, but I caught her staring off into space more than once. One evening, I came home to find her poring over old books and maps spread across the dining table. "What are you doing?" I asked. She looked up, her eyes hollow. "Research. On what?" "Lake George. There's a history of unexplained phenomena dating back centuries." I sighed. "Emily, maybe we should let this go." She shook her head. "I can't. I keep dreaming about them." "Me too," I admitted. "Then don't you want answers?" I hesitated. "What if there are no answers?" She closed a book with a thud. "I think the lake is a portal of some kind." "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" We both saw them, heard them. I rubbed my temples, a headache forming. "What are you suggesting?" "That we go back." "No, absolutely not. Jake, I need to understand." I looked into her eyes and saw a desperation that unnerved me. "Fine." I relented, "but we do it my way. We gather as much information as we can beforehand." We reached out to local historians, paranormal investigators, anyone who might shed light on the lake's mysteries. One name kept coming up: Dr. Harold Whitman, a retired professor who'd written extensively on supernatural folklore in the region. We arranged to meet him at his home near Lake George. Dr. Whitman was a frail man with piercing blue eyes that belied his age. "So, you've encountered the lake spirits," he said matter-of-factly after we'd recounted our story. "You don't seem surprised." I remarked. He smiled faintly. "There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy." Emily leaned forward. "What are they?" He regarded us thoughtfully. "Some believe they are souls trapped between worlds, drawn to the lake's unique energy. Others think they're echoes of the past, residual hauntings replaying over time." "Can they harm us?" I asked. "Not directly, but obsession can be a dangerous thing." I glanced at Emily, whose fixation had only grown. "Is there a way to help them?" she asked. Dr. Whitman sighed. "If they are indeed trapped souls, perhaps acknowledgement and compassion can bring them peace." "How do we do that?" I queried. "Return to the lake. Reach out to them. Offer closure." I wasn't thrilled with the idea, but Emily was resolute. We returned to Lake George one final time, armed with knowledge and a plan. As night fell, we stood at the water's edge, a lantern casting a warm glow around us. Emily took a deep breath. "If there are spirits here, we want to help." Silence. "We acknowledge you," she continued. "We wish you peace." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the whispers began, soft at first, then swelling around us like a chorus. The figures emerged from the lake, just as before, but this time there was something different, a sense of calm rather than foreboding. One figure stepped forward, reaching out a translucent hand. Emily extended hers in return, their fingers almost touching. "Thank you." A voice echoed in our minds. A surge of emotion washed over me, a mix of sorrow and relief. The figures slowly faded, dissolving into the mist that hovered above the lake. The whispers ceased, replaced by the gentle lapping of water against the shore. "It's over," Emily whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. I put my arm around her. "Let's go home." In the weeks that followed, the nightmares stopped. The weight that had pressed upon us lifted, and life began to feel normal again. One afternoon, Emily received a package with no return address. Inside was an old photograph of a family standing by the lake, dated 1892. Among them was a little girl who bore a striking resemblance to the figure we'd seen. On the back was a handwritten note: "Thank you for remembering." We looked at each other, a sense of awe settling between us. "Do you think?" I began. She nodded. "I do. Lake George remains a place of beauty and mystery. We haven't returned since, but sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself listening for whispers carried on the wind. If you ever find yourself by its shores, take a moment to listen. You might just hear echoes of the past, voices longing to be heard. And if you do, perhaps all they need is acknowledgement. a simple act of compassion to bridge the gap between worlds. Because some curses aren't lifted by rituals or spells, but by the understanding that we are all connected, bound by the threads of time and memory. Story number 5. Children's laughter on Bear Mountain. I've always been a city guy. The concrete jungle of New York City was my natural habitat. The constant hum of traffic, the neon lights, the crowds. But after my divorce, I needed an escape from the suffocating familiarity. My friend Mike suggested a weekend camping trip to Bear Mountain, just a couple of hours up the Hudson River. Come on, Jake, he urged. Fresh air, hiking, and a break from all this madness. It'll do you good. Reluctantly, I agreed. Maybe some time in nature would help clear my head. We set out early Saturday morning, the city skyline fading in the rearview mirror as we drove north. The air grew cleaner, the scenery greener. By noon, we arrived at the campsite, a secluded spot nestled among towering oaks and maples. As we pitched our tents, an older couple hiking by stopped to chat. Beautiful day for camping, the woman said with a warm smile. Sure is, Mike replied. Any trails you'd recommend? The man's expression grew serious. Stick to the marked paths, and if you hear anything unusual at night, best to stay in your tent. I raised an eyebrow. Unusual like what? He hesitated before answering. Just sounds carry oddly in these woods. Don't let them spook you. With that cryptic advice, they continued down the trail. Well, that wasn't ominous at all, I remarked. Mike laughed it off, probably just trying to keep the city folks on their toes. We spent the afternoon hiking to a scenic overlook. The view was breathtaking, the Hudson River winding below, the distant mountains fading into a hazy blue. This is exactly what you needed, Mike said, clapping me on the back. Maybe you're right, I admitted, feeling a sense of peace for the first time in weeks. As dusk settled, we returned to camp and built a fire. The crackling flames and the chorus of crickets created a soothing backdrop as we shared stories and reminisced about college days. Around 10 p.m., we turned in. The canopy above was a tapestry of stars, more than I'd ever seen in the city. A soft giggle woke me from a deep sleep. I lay still, listening intently. Another laugh, high-pitched, childlike, floated through the night air. I sat up, rubbing my eyes. Mike, did you hear that? His tent rustled. Hear what? Sounded like kids laughing. He groaned. Probably just other campers. Go back to sleep. I tried to brush it off, but something felt off. Who would let their kids roam the woods at this hour? The laughter came again, closer this time. Curiosity got the better of me. I unzipped my tent and stepped into the cool night air. The forest was cloaked in shadows, the fire reduced to glowing embers. A faint giggle echoed from the trees to my left. Hello, I called softly. Is someone out there? No response. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating gnarled trunks and underbrush. Nothing. Jake, what are you doing? Mike's voice was thick with sleep. I heard something. Kids, I think. He sighed. You're imagining things. Get back in the tent. I hesitated but decided he was probably right. Maybe the stress was getting to me. I awoke again to the sound of footsteps, light, almost playful, circling the campsite. My heart pounded as I listened. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, all was silent. Then, directly behind my tent, a whisper, "Come play with us." I froze. The voice was that of a child, but there was an unsettling echo to it. "Mike!" I hissed urgently. He didn't respond. I mustered the courage to speak. "Who are you?" Silence. Slowly, I reached for the tent zipper and peeked out. The flashlight revealed nothing but the dying fire and shadows stretching into the woods. This was ridiculous. I decided to wake Mike. As I approached his tent, I noticed it was unzipped, the sleeping bag inside empty. "Mike," I whispered. No answer. A chill ran down my spine. I heard the laughter again, drifting from deeper in the forest. Against all better judgment, I followed the sound, calling his name. Mike, this isn't funny. The laughter grew louder, more distorted. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of my vision, small shapes darting between the trees. I caught a glimpse of movement, a figure disappearing behind a large oak. "Hey!" I shouted, running toward it. I rounded the tree and stopped dead in my tracks. Standing there was a little girl in a tattered dress. Her back to me, relief washed over me. "Hey, are you lost? Where are your parents?" She giggled but didn't turn around. "Are you alone out here?" I took a cautious step forward. She tilted her head slightly. "Come play with us," she whispered. "Us," I echoed. She pointed into the darkness. I followed her gaze to see several more small silhouettes emerging from the shadows. Their features were obscured, but their eyes glinted in the faint moonlight. A sense of dread settled in my stomach. "Where's Mike?" I demanded, backing away. The children began to move toward me, their movements unnatural, jerky, like puppets on strings. "Stay away," I shouted, fear creeping into my voice. They giggled in unison, a hollow, echoing sound that sent chills down my spine. I turned and ran, branches whipping against my face. The laughter followed, surrounding me, disoriented. I stumbled through the woods, the beam of the flashlight bouncing wildly. I had no idea where I was going. "Jake!" A voice sang out, a child's voice but layered with a deeper, raspier tone. I tripped over a root and fell hard, the flashlight slipping from my grasp. It rolled away, coming to rest with its beam pointed at a tree. As I scrambled to my feet, I saw them, dozens of small shadows encircling me just beyond the edge of the light. My breath came in ragged gasps. "What do you want?" A boy stepped forward, his eyes reflecting the light unnaturally. "Stay with us," he said. "Where's Mike?" I demanded. "He's with us now," the girl replied, peering beside the boy. Panic surged through me. I bolted in the opposite direction, plunging deeper into the forest. The terrain grew steeper, rocks and roots threatening to trip me with every step. Their voices echoed all around. "You can't leave, Jake." I spotted a faint glow ahead, the campsite, pushing myself harder. I burst into the clearing. The fire was blazing now, though I was certain it had nearly died earlier. Mike stood by the fire, his back to me. "Mike!" I shouted, relief flooding over me. He didn't turn. "Man, we need to get out of here. There's..." He slowly turned to face me, and I staggered backward. His eyes were vacant, his expression blank. "Mike!" I whispered. He smiled faintly. "Stay with us, Jake." Behind me, the children's laughter swelled, a cacophony of eerie giggles. I glanced around frantically, realizing I was surrounded. "Join us," they chanted. My mind raced. This couldn't be real. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire, wielding it like a weapon. "Stay back." They hesitated, the flames casting distorted shadows across their faces. Seizing the moment, I dashed toward the path leading back to the parking area. "Jake!" Mike's voice called after me, now distorted and unnatural. "You can't escape." I ran harder than I ever had, lungs burning, heart pounding in my ears. The path twisted and turned, the trees closing in like looming giants. Finally, I broke through the tree line, the parking lot coming into view under the pale glow of the moon. I fumbled with my car keys, hands shaking violently. Behind me, the edge of the forest remained ominously silent. I jumped into the car and sped off, not daring to look back. I didn't stop driving until I reached the outskirts of the city, pulling into an all-night diner. I parked and tried to calm my frayed nerves. What had happened back there? Where was Mike? I called the local authorities, stumbling over my words as I explained the situation. They organized a search party, but no trace of Mike was ever found. His belongings were still at the campsite, but there were no signs of struggle. The official report listed him as missing, presumed lost in the wilderness. But I knew better. Weeks turned into months. Sleep was a rare commodity, haunted by nightmares of giggling children and vacant-eyed shadows. I tried to return to normal life, but the weight of guilt and fear was crushing. One evening, I received a call from an unknown number. "Jake," a child's voice whispered. I slammed the phone down, heart racing. They had found me, desperate for answers. I began researching the history of Bear Mountain. I discovered old legends dating back to the early settlers, stories of children who had vanished in the woods, lured by spirits mimicking familiar voices. Locals spoke of a curse, a malevolent force that claimed those who ventured too deep. Some said it was the spirits of children lost to a tragic accident. Others believed it was something far older, a darkness that had always been there. I sought out a local historian, Mrs. Thompson, hoping for guidance. She listened patiently as I recounted my story. "You shouldn't have answered their call," she said gravely. "Acknowledging them gives them power. How do I stop it?" I pleaded. She shook her head. "Once they've marked you, it's difficult to escape. You must seek protection, a cleansing ritual. Perhaps." She provided me with the name of a spiritual healer who might help. I visited the healer, an elderly man named Samuel. His small cabin was filled with the scent of sage and old books. He performed a cleansing ceremony, chanting in a language I didn't understand, burning herbs that filled the air with thick smoke. "You must not return to that place," he warned. "The connection is strong, but this should sever their hold on you." For a while, it seemed to work. The nightmares subsided, and the whispers ceased. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. 1 year later, on the anniversary of that fateful night, I received a postcard with no return address. It was a photograph of Bear Mountain, taken from the overlook where Mike and I had stood. Scrawled on the back were the words, "We miss you, Jake." Terror gripped me. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, a faint giggle from the corner of the room. I sat up, drenched in sweat. "Join us," a voice whispered. The shadows seemed to shift, growing darker, deeper. I closed my eyes tightly, repeating Samuel's chants, willing the presence to leave. Silence. When I opened my eyes, the room was empty. I knew then that I could never escape them. They would always be there, lurking at the edges of my consciousness, waiting. I've since moved far from New York, settling in a bustling city overseas. I avoid forests and parks, keeping to the safety of crowded places. But sometimes, in the quiet moments between wakefulness and sleep, I hear faint echoes of laughter. If you ever find yourself near Bear Mountain and hear children laughing in the woods, do not follow the sound. Do not call out. And above all, never acknowledge them, because once you do, they will never let you go. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey through New York's haunted forests and lakes. From the mysterious lights of Cayuga Lake to the haunting drums of Indian Lake, these stories remind us that even in the vast wilderness, we're never truly alone. If you enjoyed these tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next dive into the unknown. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, in the dark corners of New York, the shadows have secrets they're waiting to share.